good morning, everyone. How are we doing today? That was good. I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. And for today, I'd like to welcome Paul Beck back to Lakeside. Paul is a Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Senior Research Associate of the Mershan Center for National Security Studies, and will be joining us all week to share multiple lectures on our theme for the Chautauqua Lecture Series, which is Preserving Democracy by the People. And today's session is Partisan Polarization in the United States. This lecture examines political polarization among both voters and leaders and how it has grown since the early 1990s. And as a reminder, this evening we'll be welcoming Roy Bridges Jr. to Hoover Auditorium at 7:30 p.m. as the first of two keynote speakers for this holiday week. And then Tuesday at 10:30 a.m., Judge Maureen O'Connor, which is the former Ohio Supreme Court Justice and Lieutenant Governor of Ohio, will be here. As always, I do ask if you please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Paul Beck.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me? If anybody can't hear me, put a hand up. Okay. That's a test. Well, I'm really delighted to be here. I, as John said, have been here before. I've always enjoyed speaking here at Lakeside, partly because Lakeside's a wonderful place to be, generally, but also because the audience has been really good. I have a zapper up here, so if any of you fall asleep, I will be sending the laser your way. But nobody does in these talks, and so I'm really glad about that. I'm going to be here, as John said, the entire week. You'll get tired of hearing from me by probably, maybe today even, but certainly by Friday. I'm going to do four things that are sort of connected to each other. Today I'm going to talk about partisan polarization here in the United States. And I'll draw upon survey data largely, but also data on roll call voting in Congress from the United States. And then tomorrow I'm going to go international. I've been involved in a research project for several decades now that does election surveys in other countries. And we ask many of the same questions. And so it allows me to kind of travel outside of the borders of the United States and compare the United States with these other countries, which is what I will be doing. And then on Wednesday, I'm going to talk about a topic that is probably more controversial than what I'll talk about today and tomorrow, and that is threats to democracy here in the United States, but I'll also talk a little bit internationally as well. And then on Friday, in a fast-moving electoral dynamic, what I'll do is give you a preview of the 2024 elections, both at the presidential level and for Congress, and a little bit for state legislatures and the like. That changes, it seems, weekly, maybe even daily sometimes. And so I probably will be busily amending that talk between now and Friday. Okay, well, let me begin. And I should say, by the way, if I say something that just mystifies you and you want me to clarify it, raise your hand and ask me, and I'd be glad to do that. If you have questions or comments of a more substantive nature, hold those until the end, and I'll try to make sure we have enough time for a Q&A session. If you want to throw tomatoes, wait till I'm out of the room, and then you are quite welcome to do that. If they're ripe tomatoes, maybe I'll stay and catch a few of them so that my wife and I can have them for dinner tonight. Okay. Oops. That was not a good start. Okay, well, let me introduce what I'm going to talk about today by saying that partisan polarization is one of the most important political dynamics of our time. It's a difference, at least in terms of the talk that I'm going to give today, it's a difference between Democrats and Republicans. So bear that in mind as we go through the various points I'm going to make. It's also worth saying that it takes two to polarize, sometimes two candidates. So people are polarizing around those two candidates, Biden and Trump this year in the 2024 election. But sometimes it's also a polarization between people, so that one person or one group is on one side, another group is on another side. Now, the point that I want to make, and I really want to stress this, is that the very stuff of democracy is differences. Differences in values, differences in preferences between people in different parties or on different sides. And so it's not that differences are a problem. It's if the differences become so extreme that they can't really be settled, then it becomes a real problem. And as I will say later on in the talk, that's really where we are today. We've got real problems in terms of trying to deal with the issues that are on our agenda that have to be resolved over time and can't be resolved if the two parties are at loggerheads with one another or if one party simply refuses to put those issues on the agenda. I'm going to focus today on both voters using survey evidence and politicians, because both of them, of course, are polarized, and they're polarized in important ways. And the point that I'll make later on is that one of the reasons the public is so polarized is that they basically take their cues from political leaders. And so it's the political leaders who are the ones who kind of amp up the polarization. And not just political leaders, interest groups and other kinds of ideological groups. I'll compare it over time for voters going all the way back to about 1968, for members of Congress going all the way back to the immediate post-Civil War period. And you'll see what I think you'll find is an interesting timeline of polarization and how it's changed over time. I'll talk about why it's emerged. I'm a political scientist, and we are trained as social scientists not to think of single causes, but there are multiple causes. And I'll talk about these multiple causes and try to at least give you some sense of what they are. I'll talk about what the consequences are of polarization. And those consequences, as I said before, are severe and are serious. And then I'll talk about hope, how it might be decreased over time, what we can do both as citizens and what politicians can do to try to work their way through these polarized times and get back to times where there are differences still, differences on important issues, but differences that can be resolved by compromise and by good public policy. Okay, I'm going to look at voters, data from the Cadillac, maybe Cadillac's not the right word anymore, the Volvo, I guess, of election surveys. And that comes from the American National Election Studies. These surveys have been conducted actually since 1948, every presidential year, and then sometimes in the midterm elections as well. They are the blue chip surveys. They're expensive, they're very well done, their samples are very reliable, and so I'm going to draw upon the American National Election Studies. I should confess early on that these are conducted by the Center for Political Studies at the University of Michigan, where I got my training, by the way. I always told my students I would confess that at the beginning of the class and then say, but I am at Ohio State University and I root for the team that pays my paycheck, not the University of Michigan. But anyway, these are excellent surveys, and we can talk about the surveys if you want to. I'm going to look only at partisans, people who self-identify either as Democrats or as Republicans. I'm not going to talk about independents, who are about 12% of the electorate in these surveys. I'm not going to talk about people who identify with a third party. It's going to be just Democrats versus Republicans. And I'm going to talk about partisan polarization as the divisions between Democrats and Republicans. So you'll see this over and over again in the charts that I'm going to present. They, of course, this is no mystery to any of you, they're deeply divided. No question about that, both at the voter level as well as at the politician or the elected official or just official level. There's several different types of polarization. One is issue polarization, where people are on opposite sides on particular issues. Probably one where there is the deepest polarization in some ways is the issue of either immigration or abortion. And I'll show you some data on that in a little bit. There's also what political scientists and psychologists call affective polarization. And this is basically feelings, likings, dislikings. And I think that the conclusion that many of these studies come to is that affective polarization is probably more powerful than issue polarization. And people often start with their affect. They like a particular party. They like their team, in effect. And if this team takes a position on a particular issue, they're quite willing to move to that position on that issue. So this affect precedes issue positions. Not always. Some people are developing their affect out of their issue positions. But most people follow the leaders and have a really strong sense of teams and are very loyal to these teams. There's a very dangerous part of this, part of that loyalty, and that is what's referred to as partisan motivated reasoning. We all engage, psychologists tell us, in motivated reasoning. We all know what conclusions we want to come to, and we basically create our reality so that it reinforces those conclusions. It's there in the political realm as well. It's there certainly in terms of people taking positions on various issues and accepting some things as fact and other things not as fact. And it's very dangerous because if you are a partisan motivated reasoner, you're not reasoning very effectively on other dimensions. But it's there and it's common and we need to recognize that. Okay, political scientists like to measure things, and one of the things I'm going to measure so that I can describe it better is affective polarization. There are various ways to measure it, but the best way, I think, is to use what is referred to as a feeling thermometer, where people are asked in surveys, think of this thermometer scale that runs from 0 degrees to 100 degrees. How do you feel about Joe Biden on that feeling thermometer? How do you feel about Donald Trump on that feeling thermometer? Take a position there. It's hard to do this over the telephone. And so instead of 0 to 100, most phone surveys will go from 0 to 10. People can keep those kinds of numbers in mind the way they can't with a 0 to 100 scale. But the early surveys and the early surveys that the American National Election Studies performed were on this 0 to 100 scale. And in fact, the interviewer at the doorstep would simply hand somebody who had been selected for an interview a picture of a thermometer with various things marked on it and ask them to identify what their position is on that. So I'm going to use feeling thermometers. I'm going to use feeling thermometers towards candidates for office, and in particular candidates for the presidency. That, of course, as you all know, is the most visible of offices in the United States. It also has an advantage for what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, and that is that some countries don't really have political parties, at least not political parties that are stable over time. And so you don't want to ask people in those countries, what do you think of Party X? Because they're going to say, I have no idea what Party X is. And so you ask them about people who are contending for the national office that's at the top of the ballot, usually a presidency, but in some parliamentary systems, it would be a prime minister. And what I'm going to do is refer you to figure 1, which you ought to have in front of you. I like to have hard copies of these things. Did everybody get one? If you didn't get one, put your hand up and we'll make sure. Okay. There are more coming. Okay. I think we had not estimated the size of the crowd, right? I think it's a holdover from the minister who was, I understand, really good before me. And I was teasing him that he did a good warm-up for me. And I'm sure that is the reason. But let me talk about this, and then when you get the hard copy, you can look at it as well. This is the feeling thermometer for the Democratic and Republican candidates for president. And what I've shown you is since 1968, for every presidential election year, what the scores were on this feeling thermometer for Democrats on the whole and for Republicans on the whole. And what you'll see here are several things. One that is interesting, if I can get this to, well, if you look at 1972, and you'll see a high water mark there on the Republican side. And these are Republicans who were warm to the Republican candidate, where warm means, in this particular case, 70 to 100 on that feeling thermometer. And they were cold towards the Democratic candidate. 72 was the reelection of Richard Nixon, very popular at the time, soon to end, by the way, but very popular in 1972. George McGovern was the Democratic candidate, somebody who was not really very popular at all, and of course lost in a landslide election to Nixon. But what you'll see more generally over time is both the Democrats and the Republicans. And again, for Democrats, it's warm towards the Democratic candidate, cold towards the Republican candidate. And for Republicans, the dotted red line, it's warm towards the Republican candidate, cold towards the Democrat. You'll see the Democratic one steadily rising over time. The Republican one, aside from that 1972 exception, is generally rising over time, but not at the pace of the Democrats. And you'll see it's getting to the point, and again, John, the pointer's not pointing, so I just will describe this. He knows how to do this, I think. But if you look all the way to the right for 2020, you'll see that both the Democrats and the Republicans have crossed the 50-50 line. There we go. You got to use the right one, right? So what I'm talking about is right here. And the 50-50 line is important. A majority of Democrats and Republicans were warm towards their party's candidate and cold towards the opponent in that election, in the 2020 election. If we were to do this for 2024, my guess is we would be somewhere up in this range right here. And of course, that's yet to be determined in many respects. But the important point to realize is that there's been a steady rise in polarization over time, and the two parties have become pretty much the same in the extent of polarization among their voters. Okay, and I think this says on the screen pretty much what I have been telling you. It's higher in the 2012 to 2020 period, especially in 2016 and 2020. What is not in the chart, and you won't see it there, but it's other analysis that has shown this, is that it's driven more by negative evaluations of opposing leaders than by positive evaluations of their own leader. And again, these are presidential candidates. 70% of Americans were extremely negative towards Donald Trump by 2020. Over 40% of Republicans were extremely negative towards Clinton in 2016 and Biden in 2020. Among all voters, not just Democrats and Republicans, I'm adding independents in right here, Trump was seen somewhat more negative than he was among just Democrats and Democrats. At 39%, Biden was at 21%, and that's at 0 degrees. Imagine this. You're asked, you've got that feeling thermometer in front of you, and you're asked to locate candidates for president on that. Some people locate the opposing candidate at 0. Some people put their own party's candidate at 100%, giving them perfect scores. And in fact, I've got a chart that will show this. And what you see in 2016 first, and then in 2020, and these are extreme evaluations, 0 on that feeling thermometer and 100 for the candidate of your party. Democrats are the blue line, both the dotted line and the solid line, and you can see they kind of chug along here along with the Republicans, right around 20% or a little bit lower than that. And then beginning in 2016, things begin to zoom up. And 2016 for the Democrats, they really liked their candidate in 2016. But they disliked the opponent even more in 2016. And of course, by 2020, we're talking about up to over 60% are in the extreme there. Whereas in terms of Republicans disliking the Democrat, it's below that, but again, it's higher than in any place else on that particular chart. Now, do you have a figure 2 by now? Okay, no, anybody not have one? Oops. They're coming. Okay, still coming, right? Okay, it'll be something for you to take home and share with friends and relatives, if you can talk to them about politics. That's always a problem in a polarized universe. Okay, there are other indicators of polarization in terms of voter polarization that I want to talk a little bit about. One is at the beginning of a presidential administration. They've just been elected. There is this honeymoon period where people on their side are very positive about them, where people on the other side want to give them, in many cases, the benefit of the doubt, right? They haven't yet been president. And so you start out in this honeymoon period giving them not perfect scores by any means, but scores that are not going to be close at all to zero. Those honeymoons now are pretty much a thing of the past. In recent elections, the presidential winner starts out being very popular among partisans of his own party, and the presidential loser starts out with very negative evaluations, hardly given a chance at all to be able to perform while in office and earn that negative evaluation, if indeed that's what ends up happening. I also want to talk about some issues, because you can measure polarization on issues. And some scholars have done this. It turns out to be pretty complicated, because you have to decide what issues you want to use. And if you're trying to do it over time, there are issues that weren't at all on the agenda 20 and 30 years ago that all of a sudden are on the agenda. So I've chosen 3 here that I want to just give you some sense of and what's happened with them in terms of polarization. The first one is abortion, and I'm going to flip to actually this chart right here. And you won't have this in your package, because I think this one is fairly simple to look at. You'll find that by 2020, Democrats were very favorable towards abortion always, pro-choice, or with certain exceptions. Republicans were not quite the reverse, but nonetheless were more likely to cite exceptions as a reason for abortion. They're more opposed to it than they were back in 1980. And in fact, if you compare over time, I don't have that issue prior to 1980, by the way, but Republican voters were more positive towards abortion than Democrats were in the 1960s and 1970s. And I think the reason for that was that a very strong base of the Democratic electorate were Catholics, who by their training and by their values were very much opposed to abortion. That has changed over time. And what you see now by 2020 is that over 70% of Americans, of Democrats, feel that abortions always ought to be a matter of choice for, in this case, the mother or the woman. And that's a big change compared to what we see back here in 1980. Republicans really haven't moved very much there. Republicans still tend to favor, as they did back in 1980, this exceptions category. Exceptions for rape, exceptions for incest, exceptions for protecting the life of the mother. That's getting played out, by the way, in a variety of states now. And you see, like in Ohio, when voters are able to go to the polls and vote, they vote for the exceptions. they vote for Roe v. Wade or Roe v. Wade-like provisions. Okay, so abortion is the example of an issue that is polarized now, not as deeply polarized as you would think from looking at the debate at the elite or the politician level, but nonetheless polarized. There is a second issue that I want to talk about, and that's the issue of immigration. It was not so much on the agenda in 2008 and before to get asked about in these Michigan surveys and these American National Election Study surveys. But when it gets picked up by 2012, you will see that Democrats are by probably 17% in favor of increased abortion or increased immigration. Most are in the middle, saying they like the status quo, the way it is right now. Some, in fact, are in the decrease category. By 2020, the increase is higher, and in fact, it almost comes to 50%, right? So immigration is an issue that close to a majority of Democrats are supportive of, and that includes supportive of undocumented immigration, certainly dreamers, as they are called. Republicans have gone pretty much in the other direction, though not substantially so. You see them over here. They're more favorable towards a decrease in 2020, even than they were in 2012, which is kind of interesting given the debate over immigration. And they are about where they were before in terms of increases. Now what I want to show you is a third issue, and this is one that is a long-standing issue of difference between the two political parties, dating really back to the New Deal, to the Franklin Roosevelt years. The Democrats for many, many years were in favor of more government activity on behalf of jobs and standard of living. The Republicans were pretty adamantly opposed to that over time, at least at the elite level. What you find is in 1980, there were more Democrats who were in favor of that than opposed, but not by very much. Traditional Democratic issue, but there were divisions within the Democratic electorate. On the Republican side, very little division. Most Republicans, clearly over 60%, were opposed to anything that would increase the amount of spending, federal government spending, on government jobs and standard of living. By 2020, by the way, Republicans are hardly different from what they were back in 1980. Democrats have become much more favorable towards government spending to preserve or enhance the standard of living and to provide some kinds of guarantees for jobs. So three different issues. We could measure polarization along each of these issues. You could measure it for a whole basket of issues. That gets more complicated. You could measure it for liberal versus conservative ideology, and some scholars have done that. Studies of political polarization in the political science world and among political psychologists is a growth industry. Everybody seems to be doing that. I found out late last year, a colleague of mine and I are doing a paper on polarization in all these other countries that I'm going to talk about tomorrow. It turns out that the research literature, which we have to cite to be credible, now numbers in the hundreds. So we had to read hundreds of papers and many books on that same topic and try to incorporate those into the front end of the paper that we are writing. Okay, let me turn away now from voters to politicians. And there's several kinds of politicians that I want to talk about, but I'm really going to focus mostly on members of Congress. I'll come to that later on. Federal courts, as you know, these are lifetime appointments. In the old days, these lifetime appointments usually went to people who had already demonstrated that they were effective judges, or in some cases, very effective and well-known lawyers. There wasn't much of a partisan litmus test, although, of course, presidents were from a party, and the party in the Senate that had to confirm them, the majority party, also had partisan attachments. And so there was some partisanship there. But by and large, I think the standard that was employed was a standard of competence and ability. And in fact, it was often the committee of the American Bar Association that was rating the candidates, and presidents would choose from that list. Now what presidents are more likely to do, certainly the Trump presidency after 2016, was to choose from a list that had been assembled by the Federalist Society, which is a very conservative Republican society that again would rank order, rank order is not right, would identify candidates for the Supreme Court and the other judicial courts, other federal judiciary. Trump made over 200 appointments to the judiciary, almost all of them from this Federalist Society list. So it's become more partisan over time, probably on the Democratic side as well, because it sometimes takes two to tango, right? And so you can imagine the Democrats are realizing that they need to pay more attention to what the judges are likely to decide in the future, even though the judges in their confirmation hearings will not try to identify how they would vote on a particular case if it were to come before them. By the way, there's been a really interesting study of clerks who are hired by the Supreme Court justices. They are much more partisan than they used to be. It used to be all the Supreme Court justice wanted to know was how clever, how smart is this particular clerk? How well do they write? What kind of research do they do? Now it's very, very clear that they are going to people who are on their partisan side. That matters because it is the clerks who often will draft the first positions that particular justice is going to take. Now, the justice owns the position in the end, and he or she, of course, will put their own stamp on it. But if the clerks are partisans themselves, and on one side themselves, that matters for the courts, and I'm suggesting that it does today. Partisan divisions over confirmations have become more frequent. It used to be that most members of the Senate would say, well, if the Republican president has nominated a particular person to the courts, and that person has good credentials, we should give them the benefit of the doubt. They, after all, have been elected as president, and one of the powers the president has is the power of nomination to the federal judiciary. That's changed over time. The most recent vote for Justice Brown Jackson, who indeed was confirmed in 2022, was a 53 to 47 split in the Senate, with almost all Republicans voting against her. I think there were two exceptions to that, if I remember correctly, and all Democrats voting in favor of her. There are a lot of confirmations to the executive branch of government, and I'll talk a little bit about that on Wednesday, but for right now, it will suffice to say that what the Senate, and it's the Senate that confirms, what the Senate has typically done is given the benefit of the doubt to the president, saying it's his team who are going to be the Secretary of Justice, or excuse me, the Attorney General, or the Secretary of these various cabinet departments, and the top policymakers within them. We ought to give the benefit of the doubt to the president so that he can assemble the team that he wants there. That has changed over time as well. There are many, many more battles now over confirmations, with the party of the president almost uniformly in favor of that particular nomination, with the party that opposes the president almost uniformly opposed to that candidate. And so it's basically a power struggle in the Senate, trying to accumulate enough votes to get a majority to be able to confirm that member. Congress, as you know, we all see this, is deeply divided along partisan lines. So divided that there almost is nobody left in the middle anymore. There are very few members of Congress, certainly in the Senate where they're more visible, but very few members of Congress who are sort of in the middle who vote with their party sometimes, vote with the other party sometimes. More often with their own party, but they're quite willing to vote with the other party if they are on the same or have the same position or issue preference there. Nobody in the middle anymore. The middle is a very empty space. In a 50-50 Senate, 60 votes are needed to end a filibuster. And most legislation can be filibustered, and it often is. And that tends to accentuate polarization. The party that is out of office, that doesn't control the presidency, recognizes that if it can muster a majority of votes, it is going to be able to stop the filibuster from being ended and extract some concessions from the opposing party. I'm not going to talk about state legislatures, but they are, in many cases, as polarized as the U.S. Congress is. You certainly see this in Ohio. And many state legislatures, by the way, around the country, are controlled by a single party, where they often have super majorities. And in those cases, there almost is no brook given to the opposition. They just go ahead and push through whatever their priority happens to be. So polarization doesn't end in Washington, D.C. It goes on beyond Washington, D.C. Okay, let me focus now on the U.S. Congress. And the reason that I do that is that we have really good data on Congress. And the data comes from roll call votes, public votes that are taken by members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate. Most of these roll call votes can be arrayed along a liberal to conservative continuum. Not all of them. Some of them are issues that really don't lend themselves to some kind of ideological characterization, but most of them do. And there's scholars who have worked very hard to look at all the roll call votes in Congress from 1879. My students wouldn't appreciate this, but I'll say it here. I was not alive then, so I did not view that. But they, I think, doubted that probably. But anyway, from 1879, these scholars have arrayed roll call votes along this left-right or liberal-conservative continuum. And that allows you then to determine how much polarization there is on these kinds of issues. And the polarization is the difference between the parties, between members of the parties, in voting on these liberal versus conservative issues, okay? Not all issues, not all roll calls, but almost all roll calls. And let me go to, too many things to hold in my hand here. Okay, and this is a chart you should have by now. Not yet, they're coming, okay. I think John wasn't sure what the crowd was going to be in terms of its size, and so there weren't enough. What you'll see here, and this is a chart, by the way, I love, because it's really neat to be able to analyze things from 1879, when I was not alive, mind you, all the way up to 2020. We don't have it yet for beyond 2020. I actually have it for 2023, and you can see that there. But I don't have it, of course, for 2024 because that congressional session is not over yet. Now, it's a very interesting trajectory because you see after the Civil War that partisanship was very, very high. The distance between the party averages or the party means. Red for the House of Representatives, blue for the Senate. Just a quick note, by the way, is that they tend to travel together. The kind of polarization there is in the House is paralleled pretty much by the kind of polarization there is in the U.S. Senate. And the trajectory is really interesting. Post-war period all the way into the early 1900s, you have high levels of polarization. The parties are really at loggerheads with one another. And then it begins to steadily decline over time. So that by the 1930s and 1940s, it is almost half the time, well, it almost reaches half the time, but not 70 and 80% of the time. This is a period that is called the domination of Congress by the conservative coalition. Southern Democrats, who ideologically were conservative, particularly on civil rights issues, but on other issues as well, certainly government spending issues. There's a good reason, by the way, why Social Security was not extended to farm workers in its early days. And that reason was that most farm workers, certainly in the South, were African Americans. And Southern members of Congress would not vote for that. And so the bill was written in such a way that farm workers were excluded from that, but added in later on, decades later. But anyway, there is this trough right here where polarization is really dampened down, and then it begins to grow over time. One of the reasons that it grows over time is the South, the conservative South, conservative Southern voters, were no longer Democrats. They more and more migrated towards the Republican Party. And so you had ideology lining up with partisan conviction, with partisan identifications. And you see it continuing to climb all the way to this figure right here is for 2023. And you'll see now that this polarization is almost perfect, almost 1.0, which would be 100% of the roll call votes. Not quite, and I'll talk about some exceptions later on. But nonetheless, a very interesting pattern here. And there are reasons, as I pointed out, for this trough right here. There are reasons for the rise right here. There are reasons right here why polarization was so sharp immediately after the Civil War. If you know your post-Civil War history, you will recognize that the Civil War was a cauldron of partisan fighting in the South. And the Democratic Party basically reestablished itself as the governing party in Southern and Confederate state after Confederate state, shrunk the electorate, drove out African Americans, drove out populists, white populists, who also were organizing to try to get these Southern governments to do more for them. And by 1900, the South was a one-party area controlled by the Democrats, controlled by the Democratic, as one scholar put it, the Democratic Bourbons, the elites, plantation owners by and large in the South. Okay, and here are the figures that are coming. Okay, what I want to talk about next is why. Why do we have the polarization that we have, and why has it changed over time? Some of that I've already talked about, and I'll probably go over that a bit. But partisans now are farther apart on the issues. There's much more of a correlation between their positions on various issues of the day and their partisan loyalty. This has occurred in part because of what I already talked about, this realignment that occurred in the South, particularly during and after the Civil Rights era. Whereas Southern Democrats now are what? Majority, well, I'm not saying it right. White Southerners now are majority Republican. Black Southerners now are heavily Democratic. It was just the reverse prior to the 1960s. Blacks were attracted to the party of Lincoln. Whites were attracted to the party of segregation and the party that had in their mind been defeated. Well, never in their mind defeated, but the party that had not won the Civil War. There's also in that period of time, in recent decades, a rise in issues that are harder to compromise, harder to find a middle ground on. One has to do with religious values, and abortion, of course, would be a centerpiece of that. Another one has to do with taxes and no tax positions. A third one has to do with racial issues, civil rights issues. Harder to compromise there. And so as more of those issues move on to the agenda of politics, polarization ensues. Polarization is amplified. There also has been a rise of what tends to be called identity politics, where the Democratic and Republican parties are not just political parties, they are tribes. They are are tribes that need to get your loyalty if you're a member of one or the other of them. And sometimes it's unquestioned loyalty. The example that I like to give, by the way, is if you put yourself in Donald Trump's shoes in 2014, 2015. Remember, he had early on thought about running as an independent for president. And then he had thought about running as a third-party candidate. He also had approached leaders of both parties saying, hey, I would make a good candidate for your party. So he didn't really have a party, but I think he recognized, he hasn't said this, but this is my own analysis. He recognized that if he ran for the nomination of one of the parties, and it was going to be the Republican Party, he not only would attract voters who really liked him, but he would also attract these people who had a Republican identity. And he would get them as well, even if they didn't necessarily agree with him on a whole series of issues. So the Republican nomination for him was a great prize. And it was a prize, of course, he successfully won and carried with him going forward. Political discourse, as you all know, I don't have to tell you this, has become more partisan and more polarized, partly because of pressure from left and right-wing ideological groups. And that pressure has become intense. If you are identified as a rhino, a Republican in name only, or a dino, I guess it would be, a Democrat in name only, you're going to get all kinds of criticism from these ideological groups. And they're more active. I read a figure the other day that the number of people who are not maybe working on K Street, K Street's where the lobbyists are, the big lobbying companies in Washington, but that number of registered lobbyists now is about 1,700 in Washington, D.C., and of course many, many more across the 50 states. Many of these groups, many of these lobbyist groups are ideological in nature, and the minute a candidate for office moves away from the ideological position they prefer, they spend money to attack that person. And so members of Congress are eager to avoid those kinds of attacks themselves. And so they often are propelled to their positions because they're afraid they are going to get either primaried, where somebody who is even more extreme than they are is going to try to run for the nomination of their party, or the money is just going to be frozen. They're not going to get the kind of donations from political action committees and interest groups that they ordinarily get. Campaigning has become increasingly toxic. Nasty things are said about the candidates. Not so much, by the way, by candidates for office, though there's some exceptions to that. But much of the toxicity comes from these independent groups, from these pressure groups, these ideological groups, because it's almost as if the candidate can say, hey, I really want to attack my opponent, but I don't want to be perceived as nasty, so you do that for me. And indeed they do. Now, they have to be independent of the candidate, but they're independent by what? A wink and a nod. And in fact, many of the people who are the directors of these political action groups that are set up around election time or continue from election to election are people who have worked on a presidential candidate's campaign. And so they don't even have to talk to them about what to do in terms of their own television advertising. They know what to do, and they know what the candidate is going to favor. That means the opposition is seen more negatively, right? In a personalistic kind of way. And there's an increase also in partisan spin and fake news, and on what one campaign consultant talked about as alternative facts. We've got our facts, you've got your facts. They are just alternative facts, different ways of seeing the world, I guess. Well, facts are facts, I guess, would be the way to say that. Politicians always spin. They are always going to want to present themselves in the most favorable way that they can. We know this. Some spin more than others. And there's been, I think, an increase in the amount of spin that has taken place. Okay, a third thing that's happened over time, and I need to spend some time developing this, is that all of us live, particularly partisans, live in what are called echo chambers, where we are surrounded by people who tend to agree with us. Those are the people that we want to talk to about politics. We also recognize that when Uncle John comes to the Thanksgiving dinner table, we don't want to raise any kind of political issue with him because he takes the other side, whatever that may happen to be. When I was back teaching, I had a class that met on Wednesday afternoons, met before Thanksgiving holiday, and I recognized that even though the students had, of course, the Thanksgiving weekend off, Thursday and Friday, many of them wanted to go home on Wednesday, right? And my class met at 3:30 in the afternoon, and so being a wise professor, I said to them, I'm going to cancel class on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving on one condition. When you are home at the Thanksgiving dinner table, you have to talk about political parties, which was the class I was teaching. And I looked out on these faces of the students, and I could just see that that was not going to happen. So again, it's echo chambers. We tend to surround ourselves, I think more and more, with people that we agree with and we know will agree with us. And we do this because we don't want to jeopardize a friendship by talking across party lines in an increasingly polarized world. We also find echo chambers in the media. And here the story is in some ways more complicated, but interesting as well. If you go back to, as I look upon this audience, as you go back to our time when we were first getting involved and paying attention to politics, we basically tuned in 3 different television stations, right? 3 different networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. We tuned in the evening news. The evening news was pretty balanced, actually, and I've actually coded the evening news from that era, and it was quite balanced, and they worked very hard to try to balance it. Over time, that has changed, and it's changed because we have moved from what's called broadcasting to narrowcasting, with the emergence particularly of the stations that don't have to be broadcasting stations, are not licensed by the federal government, are not controlled, or not, well, control is not the right word, are not supposed to try to be balanced. All of them cable stations. And people who are already polarized and already ideological, who have positions on ideological matters or on issues, know where they can go to get news that is reinforcing. The best example of this is one that came out of this New York City trial recently, and that is the National Enquirer. Not a newspaper that most of you read, I suppose, and I haven't seen it any longer at the grocery stores. Maybe it's there. My wife would have to tell you because she's the one who goes to the grocery store, but I don't think she's reading it on the stands there. But the National Enquirer was doing what? 2 things. One was promoting the Trump candidacy in every way that they could. And secondly, attacking all of his opponents, be they Republican opponents in the primaries or the Democratic opponent in the general election. They also, of course, as we know from that trial, were withholding news that would have been detrimental to the Trump campaign. And so there is that, and the National Enquirer, of course, is the best case of that, but there also are media in the cable world that are more on the right. And if you're on the right, you go there for your news, and the evidence is pretty clear that you can find it there. And there also are cable stations on the left, and if you want to go there for your news, you can easily find that. And a lot of people do that. And what it has is a reinforcing echo chamber effect, where they start out with a certain set of beliefs, and then those beliefs get reinforced by the news that they're consuming, by the alternative facts that are getting played out in those particular media. And that's been a very, very common pattern over time, and it has increased over time. Social media have amplified that. Social media, again, is a place where you can go to your friends, have your views reinforced through the social media. Many people, and I think it's particularly true of younger Americans, get almost all of their news through the social media. And if they are at all ideological in orientation, they are getting news that is slanted in the direction of that particular ideology. There also are what are called by economists selection effects. We don't get just any candidates for president or these other offices. We get candidates who are much more in line with the prevailing ideology within that party. And in fact, in primaries, some of these candidates are able to defeat incumbent members of Congress, let's say, because the incumbent member of Congress is not extreme enough in the kinds of positions that they're taking. And so over time, what you find is a Congress, let's say, or a state legislature that is much more ideological, even than the people who are supporting at the ballot box those members of that legislative assembly. And you see this clearly in the Congress, the problem that both the Speaker of the House and the Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell of the Senate have, is trying to rein in the extremists within their caucus. And they find they can't really do that very effectively. It costs several speakers, including our own John Boehner here in Ohio, it cost them their position because they couldn't deal with this minority faction that was very extreme and would attack the other members of that party as being rhinos, as being Republicans in this case, in name only. So there's a selection effect, and that continues over time. The members of Congress, particularly of the Senate, who opposed Donald Trump openly, who voted in favor of convicting him in the Senate impeachment trial, are virtually gone from the U.S. Senate. And they've been replaced by people who are more extreme partisans than they were. Gerrymandering, by the way, is an important element there. You see this in Ohio, certainly, where about 53%, maybe 54% of Ohioans are voting Republican in statewide elections, and yet we have a House of Representatives, a lower house, that has a supermajority of Republicans, and a Senate that even has a greater supermajority of Republicans. And so there's a disconnect there. And it's a disconnect because largely of gerrymandering, because the districts are created in such a way. You'll hear more about this tomorrow from Judge Maureen O'Connor, but districts that were created to favor one party over the other. The anecdote, by the way, I like to talk about there, and I need to keep an eye on time, is that in the 1870s and 1880s, the Ohio legislature redistricted 7 times. Every time a new majority was elected, they went and changed the district lines. And they changed the district lines in a way that they thought would preserve their majority, only to find out a couple of years later that the other party was winning a majority of the votes and was able to displace them. Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but it's important to realize that gerrymandering is important, and it creates safe legislative seats where the primary determines the outcome. And then finally, I want to emphasize something that's very important, and that is that voters, the first set of slides that I talked about, tend to follow their leaders. And their leaders themselves can be polarized, and they can amp up the polarization simply by the positions they take. Okay, I'm going to very quickly talk about consequences because I want to make sure I'm allowing time for questions and answers. There are costs of partisan polarization for governance and for policy making. Makes it hard for the opposite sides to agree, to compromise on anything. And it makes it more difficult for them to address what are the major issues of the day that require hard bargaining and compromise to be able to resolve. And the 3 I like to talk about there are climate change, where there is action from Congress but it's action that is opposed by the opposition party in such a way that they really can't go very far. The second one is trying to come to some kind of solution for what's going to happen with Social Security and Medicare in the next decade. When it looks like the trust funds are going to run out of money, and then the question becomes, how do you finance Social Security and Medicare? Medicare would run out of funds earlier, but just, I think, a couple of years earlier. Many of you probably don't rely on Social Security. Many Americans do, of course. But think about what would happen if all of a sudden Medicare could only finance 70% of the medical bills that they used to finance for you. It's a real problem. It's a problem that needs to get all kinds of attention. Immigration is the third one. Both of the parties have different, or each party has different views on immigration, but they can't really resolve those differences in a way that would be some kind of a lasting compromise. They came close to it this year. Donald Trump weighed in and said, no, I don't want a solution to this because I want to use it as a campaign issue. And of course, he is indeed doing that. Frequent changes in party control of government make compromise difficult because one party, once it gets into power, undoes what the previous party had done. The best example of this is the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, whereas Republicans tried to undo it, and only the vote of John McCain in the Senate, only one vote prevented that from happening. And they will no doubt be at it again because they're strong opponents of Obamacare. If there are disagreements on facts, it's hard for there to be agreement on solutions. There are costs for democracy. The shrillness of partisan debate, which we all live in these days, turns off voters, makes voters more disaffected, leads them to not want to vote in elections, leads them to have less trust in government and governmental institutions, and probably for good reason, right? Because those institutions don't tend to be performing very well. Parties and politicians are often seen in negative terms. They never are seen and haven't been seen since the Republic began in highly positive terms. But they're seen much more negatively today than was the case. And that leads to the rise of anti-establishment outsiders who say basically, I'm not a politician. I'm a good guy, and you ought to vote for me for that reason. And you've seen, I think, the consequences of that. There are benefits. Party differences are easier to identify. Political scientists like that because they like voters to vote on the issues, and those issues are more clear-cut than they used to be. So there was more issue-based voting. There's more accountability. Politics matters more, but it only matters for partisans. People are turned off by it. And so partisans are turning out at higher levels than before, are more involved politically than before. Right now, I think the costs far outweigh the benefits, but there are benefits to it. And let me end on this. I'm just going to put these on the screen. I'm going to very quickly mention them. Partisan polarization will go down, will subside, when and if voters are less tribal, less engaged in motivated reasoning, punish extremists in primaries and general elections by voting against them, punish governing parties that are much more concerned with winning than producing good policy and governing. And finally, voters need to be better able to distinguish fake news from real news, a challenge, obviously. Leaders need to prioritize issues on which they agree, in which they can find some room for compromise. Politicians' rhetoric needs to be more civil, less vituperative. Good luck. We'll see if that happens. We need to elect presidents who will reach across party lines to fulfill campaign promises, will reach out to the other side and try to get at least some buy-in there. And we need to have legislative parties that will marginalize extremists, give them much less room to operate in it. That so far hasn't happened. Well, it's happened more on the Democratic side than the Republican side. But there still are extreme groups in both parties that make it very difficult for there to be any kind of compromise on issues. Well, let me stop at that point. I've gone on, John, I apologize. I've gone on far too far. But I do want to leave some time for questions, hopefully answers, though I won't promise you answers, but at least I'd like to hear some questions. And I think John is walking around with a microphone, so maybe right down here.
So my question is, you talked about the United States being more polarized than other democratic countries. Can you name some of those countries? And then secondly, I have a question about how much you think income inequality has fed into this polarization, if any, in having so many people who are so wealthy directing the news and the lobbyists and so on.
Okay, let me come to two quick answers there. One is to invite you to come tomorrow, and you will see the other countries that are like us in polarization. Most are not. The examples I will give are Brazil in 2022, and we did a survey there in my research group, and Brazil was every bit as polarized in the electorate as we were in 2020. The other one was, my favorite example is a country you've probably never heard of, Mozambique. Mozambique was a country we did a survey in 20 years ago almost. And the survey was conducted a little less than 10 years after they had had a civil war in which over 400,000 people were killed. And it was a tribal war. And those two tribes became the dominant political parties in Mozambique. And when they ran for election against each other in that election, I think it was 2006, the electorate was highly polarized around them. The other countries don't even come close to us. France doesn't. Germany certainly doesn't. The other question, I'm now forgetting what it was. Money in politics. One of the big problems these days is that we can't control the flow of money in politics. It's not the candidates and their campaigns who are raising and spending large amounts of money, although they are, but we know who the donors are and we know who is controlling that money. It's the independent groups, some of whom don't even have to tell you who the donors were to their funds. In the Ohio Senate race, by the way, coming up, there will be probably upwards of $100 million spent on both sides. Much of that will be spent by political action committees that are independent of the candidates. That's a problem. It's a problem because they can engage in very vituperative campaign rhetoric. And the candidates can say, it's not me. I'm not the one who is authorizing this. And they'll be right in a technical sense. But they nonetheless will probably like it because it will be designed to undercut their opponent. Okay, hopefully I've answered that. But come tomorrow to see all this array of, I think it's a total of 51 country elections that I'll be comparing us with. Other questions?
Yes, I have strong political opinions, as I'm sure many of you do, but I have never participated in an opinion poll about those opinions. I suspect it's because I never answer my phone unless I know who it is.
Yes.
And I'm very careful about what I respond to on social media. So who are they asking, and how confident are we that they are representative?
Okay, question about polling and the reliability of polling. I've never been polled either, and it's because I screen all the calls that come in on my landline, and if it came in on my cell phone, I would just totally ignore it. But some people aren't that way. The polls, I think, well, I don't want to answer it that way. There is a website called 538 that Nate Silver has run for years. I think he's not doing it anymore, but he was doing it for the New York Times for a while. And one of the things they did was they graded all of the over 500, I believe it was, public opinion firms that were conducting election polling. And they gave some an A+. Those are really reliable polls. They measured, they did their ratings based on two things. One is, does the pollster tell you how they've done the polling, who they've talked to, how they've selected those respondents, how they have weighted those respondents so that they can basically get a demographically representative group of people, and all the polls weight their respondents. And then whether they're looking at voters who are just registered to vote versus voters who are likely to vote. And there's a difference there. In Ohio, there are a large number of people who are registered to vote who don't vote in presidential elections. They shouldn't be included in those polls. So Nate Silver and his group have done these ratings. I don't remember off the top of my head what the top rated ones were. I think one of them was the New York Times, Siena College. Another one was ABC and the Washington Post. A third was a little poll that is done in the state of Iowa that's very reliable over time and has been really good at showing the results of the Iowa caucuses. But polling is what? An industry. There will be over 1,500 polls this year, over 1,500, not just of presidential, but of other elections as well. The response rates to these polls have plummeted over time. Fewer and fewer people are willing to respond to the polls. The pollsters have had to correct for that by weighting, by essentially saying we need to get the right demographic mix of people in our poll. Most of those weighting procedures are actually pretty good. Most polls end up being fairly reliable. Every once in a while they will miss things. There is what's called a sampling error that you ought to take into account. It's a plus or minus 3%, 4%, something like that. And the actual point is somewhere in that range right there. You are right, I think, to be skeptical of polls. That means you shouldn't rely on any single one because there can be outliers that give a result that you might like or you might actively dislike that is then simply counteracted by other polls. So you should look at the average, and you should pay attention to the polls that are of high quality and those that aren't. And I'll refer you to the Nate Silver website, 538, if you want to see the grades given to all of these. I think it was upwards of 500 different polling organizations. Some, by the way, are at the bottom. Some are in pretty good shape. Fox News, by the way, runs a poll that is given very high grades. Grades that are so high and results that are so much in keeping with other pollsters that candidates for office who are favored by Fox News attack Fox News for the polling, which is kind of an interesting result. Okay, other questions? One way back there. Yes, go ahead.
Do you think that term limits in Congress would help in reducing partisanship and polarization?
Term limits. I've not normally been a fan of term limits, although I'd like to see them for the Supreme Court, though that's not going to happen anytime soon. Mainly because some of the justices are just too old and should retire, but it's up to them, basically. The problem with term limits is, and we've seen it here in the Ohio legislature, is that they give lobbyists much more influence over legislation than they should have. Because the members of the legislature, particularly the rookie members, know nothing about the history of a particular bill or a particular issue. And so they turn to the lobbyists, who in many cases will actually write the legislation for them. So I think term limits, while a good idea in some ways, is an idea that has severe consequences that are not consequences we would particularly like. Where term limits have been employed, by the way, I think the bottom line is, well, they haven't worked as well as we hoped they would. And so maybe we ought to try something else as a way to try to limit polarization. There's a question there. Yes.
Um, okay. The Supreme Court, I think, what was it, Harry Reeder, I think, something happened quite a few years ago in which you don't have to have 60% for a Supreme Court justice to be approved, and it has to do with cloture, which I've never understood, and it has to do with filibustering, which I've never understood. When Mr. Smith went to Washington, he actually had to work on it. Now it's just kind of like they assume everything's going to be filibustered, so they don't bother even filibustering. They just make sure it's 60%, which is kind of confusing too. But frankly, I would think if the Supreme Court approvals have to be 60%, there would be more of a compromise because they have to deal with the other party to get 60%, so that you wouldn't have such extreme justices. So I always thought the Supreme Court was one place where there wouldn't be so much partisanship. Is that, now that it's 51%, I guess, is it more partisan now than in the future?
Yeah, the quick answer to that is probably. Let me say a couple of things about the filibuster. One is the filibuster's been with us for decades upon decades. However, it was hardly ever used. Now what's been happening is that it is used more frequently, but even more importantly, the threat of filibuster is controlling. And if a member of the Senate, and it's only in the Senate, says, I'm going to filibuster, the tendency is for the people who are pushing that legislation to back off because they don't realize, they don't feel they can get the votes to be able to close off the filibuster. Cloture is a vote to end the filibuster. And cloture takes a 60% vote to be able to end the filibuster. And so it doesn't happen very often. The deal that was struck maybe just a decade ago, maybe even less than that, was to allow the filibuster to continue for most pieces of legislation, most policy, but for confirmations to not allow the filibuster for confirmations to the federal judiciary. And that was a compromise. Otherwise, the bill would have been filibustered, I guess, is the way to say it. And so they got that through. Right now, I think that if you've got a majority in the Senate and your president is of your party, you're going to go ahead and push whoever he, and it's always been a he, of course, whoever he wants as that particular nominee. And you may get them nominated by, what was the Brown-Jackson level? I think it was 53 to 47. So that's pretty tight. Okay, other questions? And again, I should say at this point, we've gone well beyond the time that you were promised. If you have to leave, by all means leave. I won't be offended by that. But I also want to be here to take whatever questions there are. Yes, go ahead.
I'm in a state that's a third, Republican, Democrat, and Independent. What are pollsters going to do with those independents? Because we need to know.
Well, they would, if the independent, is this Ohio that you're talking about? Arizona, okay. But it would be Ohio too. There are more non-affiliated registered voters in Ohio than there are either Democrats or Republicans. Excuse me. Independents are included in the polls. What they're doing is they're sampling for their polls either from the registration rolls or from panels that they have assembled before, usually by telephone, where they get a pretty representative set of people, and then they draw their sample from that particular panel. So independents are there. The tricky thing about polling is that if you're conducting a poll, let's say right now, a lot of voters haven't decided how they're going to vote. Now, most have by now. Most know how they're going to vote. But there are going to be some, and in fact a decisive number, who probably haven't yet decided. And what do you do with them? And what do you do with people who aren't going to turn out in the election? The questions that are sometimes asked is, are you registered? Yes. Do you know where your polling place is? Well, I'm not sure I really do. Have you voted in recent elections? Well, I'm not sure that I have. Those are people who are not going to be eliminated. They'll be downweighted, so they don't figure in as much as other respondents would in those polls. Polling is a very tricky business, a very difficult business. And it's moved from when I was first trained at the University of Michigan by the premier Center for Surveys in the country. We were told face-to-face is the way to do it. You go to the doorstep, you talk to people there, you can use all kinds of props to get them to identify, let's say, a feeling thermometer. But of course, what happened there? People didn't want to let people into their houses. This was certainly true during the pandemic. People also, pollsters, didn't want to send their interviewers into areas of the town that were probably not safe areas for them. And so face-to-face polling has virtually ended in the United States. Face-to-face polling is more common in a few other countries, but those are countries without good cell phone service. Not many countries have poor cell phone service, by the way, and certainly not countries with landlines. So they moved away from face-to-face towards the telephone. And the telephone was a viable way of contacting people until people got answering machines in which they could screen calls and didn't really want to participate in any kind of surveys. And of course, there are thousands of surveys across the country at any time. Many of them marketing surveys, you just don't want to deal with them. And so they've gone now, and we have when we do our U.S. survey, and we're going to do one at after the 2024 election here in the United States, we will go to an internet survey. But it's an internet survey in which, by telephone, the survey organization has identified a panel of thousands of people who are willing to do surveys. And then we'll select from that panel people for this particular political survey. There's a danger in that. It may be that the people who are willing to do surveys are different from the normal electorate. And it may be that the people who are willing to do an election survey are a different subset from that panel. And there are ways to correct for that, but those ways are not infallible. And so you always have to be conscious that you can make a mistake, and sometimes a big mistake, actually, in doing the polling. And that is why you should rely on other polls and make sure you're kind of averaging things mentally when you see poll results. Okay, more questions?
One more.
John says one more, and I will stay afterwards if you want to come up and ask questions.
The one thing I was going to ask about, you kind of circled around statistics more than once here, and most of us are kind of like Clocher when it comes to anyway, early on you talked about the relationship between the Senate and the,
Senate and the House in terms of
and you
elected
implied that
members.
one was causing the other.
Oh, okay.
And I wondered if you were, tell us why.
Okay, I wasn't trying to imply that the Senate or the House is in the lead in terms of influencing other legislators. But those of us as voters often pick up our cues from politicians that we admire. And so if politician X is in favor of a particular issue, even if we've never thought about it before, we might be inclined to say, well, yes, that's a good position to take. Or if there's a politician we don't like who sounds off on a particular issue, we will say, I don't like him, I'm going to take the other side on that issue. And so it's leaders who are leading, in effect, for better or for worse, voters. Now, not all voters are that way. Some voters have very fixed views about things and are not going to be led or cued by politicians. But there are always issues on the side that they haven't thought about where they will follow these cues. And the evidence is pretty clear that what the leaders do drives what people think about the issues. And I think that, John, was supposed to be the last question, right? Well, thank you very much.